Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really plunging into one of those questions that's just huge, enduring. Who am I?
It really is fundamental, isn't it? It pops up everywhere.
Exactly. Whether you're deep into philosophy or just having a quiet moment thinking about things. So this deep dive, we're going to explore that question, but specifically looking at these fascinating, sometimes really contradictory ways Western philosophy and Zen Buddhism tackle the whole idea of the self.
And the contrast is, well, it's pretty stark.
Yeah. We've got a great collection of sources here, excerpts, dialogues, insights featuring figures like Kenzo and Yuno who really grapple with these ideas. Our mission, basically, is to pull out the key insights, look at the surprising bits, and hopefully give you a clearer picture of how these different views shape, well, everything, how we see ourselves, identity, consciousness. It might shift your perspective a bit.
I think it will. And what's really interesting, like you said, is that this isn't just some academic exercise, is it?
No, not at all.
It goes right to the heart of how we perceive our own existence, how we relate to the world, even how we experience our own thoughts. It's very personal.
Definitely.
So the goal here is really to help you navigate these, let's face it, complex ideas without feeling, totally lost.
Rob?
We'll focus on the core insights, the practical stuff, what it means for your understanding of who you are. Would you think about this stuff all the time, or maybe you're just getting curious?
Right. So where should we start? Maybe with the familiar ground, the Western view.
Yeah, let's ground ourselves there first. It's often the default setting, you could say, for many of us.
Absolutely. So when we talk about the self in the West, our minds tend to jump to a very specific kind of picture, don't they?
A kind of entity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Western philosophy for, well, centuries really has kind of built this idea of identity based on what we do and especially maybe what we think.
Right. Action and cognition.
So the core concept that sort of emerges is this idea of the self as, like you said, an entity, something solid, separate from everything else, clearly defined.
Like an object you can almost point to inside yourself.
Yes, something you can grasp, understand through looking inward, defining its edges. And this perspective suggests that you exist because you're doing these things, thinking, choosing, reflecting.
These aren't just things the self does. They're kind of what makes the self real, what confirms its existence.
Exactly. And you can't talk about this without mentioning René Descartes, right? His famous statement, I think, therefore I am. Cogito, ergo sum. It's like the bedrock of this whole Western way of thinking about it.
It's the immediate go-to, isn't it? And what's really profound there is how he rooted identity, existence itself, in that act of thinking, of introspection.
Yeah. It establishes a self that's separate and crucially verifiable just by its own thoughts. Our sources point out this phrase makes thinking the absolute foundation.
The bedrock, yeah. It implies that just the act of being aware of your own thoughts is proof. Proof that there's you doing the thinking.
A thinker?
A thinker, yes. A distinct individual entity. It's not just that thoughts are happening, it's that there's a you behind them, and that you is separate because of that awareness. It's a powerful statement of, well, individual consciousness.
And then you see this idea evolve, right, with thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard. He brings in this really strong emphasis on choice.
Ah, yes. Choice as the defining act.
Exactly. For Kierkegaard, the self isn't just passively thinking. It's actively shaped by the choices it makes. His philosophy basically says, you are because you choose.
So every decision, every commitment, it actually builds who you are.
That's the idea. It gives the self its unique shape, its direction, and this ties so strongly into that Western focus on agency, individual responsibility.
Right. You're not just given a self, you're actively making it through your freedom, through choosing.
Which puts a lot of weight on the individual, doesn't it? Both a burden and a kind of freedom. Your identity is forged, not just found.
A continuous creation.
And then, to add another layer, you have someone like Jean-Paul Sartre. Existentialism, he really digs into the role of reflection and consciousness.
Right, the self-awareness aspect.
Yeah. Sartre kind of echoes this idea. You are because you reflect. It's about our ability to look at ourselves, contemplate our existence, our past, our future possibilities.
That constant turning back of consciousness upon itself.
That's what shapes us, according to Sartre.
Yeah.
It's not a fixed blueprint, but a self that's always in the process of becoming. Defining itself through its conscious engagement with the world, its choices, and importantly, its awareness of those choices.
And the consequences, yeah. That burden and freedom again.
So if you put it all together, this Western view really paints the self as this this fixed thing almost, a definable entity, like an inner core you can find if you look hard enough.
An object for introspection.
Exactly, and it strongly emphasizes individuality. Separation. Me here, world out there. Clear boundaries.
Which fosters that strong sense of personal identity we often strive for.
Right. So, connecting this back to you, the listener, think about how this plays out in your own life. How often do you find yourself trying to pin down who you are? Maybe define yourself by your job, your relationships, your history, your ambitions.
We look for those labels.
Yeah. This whole Western framework really pushes us towards creating that fixed identity, constantly searching for the answer to, who am I? It can feel like this huge quest.
And maybe even a source of anxiety if we don't have a neat answer ready. Like if I can't label myself clearly, am I somehow incomplete?
Totally. It encourages this constant search for a definition, maybe even a feeling of performing your identity for yourself and others.
Okay, so that's a really powerful and, like we said, deeply ingrained way of seeing things. And it sets the stage perfectly for, well, a pretty dramatic shift.
A total change of perspective, yeah.
Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, Zen philosophy offers something radically different, a real departure from that idea of a fixed, definable self.
It really throws a wrench in the works, doesn't it?
It does. The fundamental contrast is, well, it's striking. Zen does not see the self as fixed, solid, or separate. Our sources put it bluntly. Zen takes a more radical approach, suggesting that the self may not exist in the way one typically perceives it.
Whoa. Okay, so let's unpack that because that sounds potentially confronting. Does that mean Zen says we don't exist?
Ah, good question. No, it's crucial to get this right. It's not saying you don't exist or your experiences aren't real or your actions don't matter. Not at all.
Okay.
What it is doing is radically reframing what we mean by self. What it is, or maybe more accurately, what it isn't. It's subtle, but the implications are huge. It challenges our most basic assumptions.
So it's not denying experience, but questioning the nature of the experiencer.
That's a great way to put it. Zen posits that the self is not fixed, and importantly, it's not an object.
Not an object, meaning not a thing you can grab a hold of or define.
Exactly. It directly challenges that Western idea of a graspable entity you can analyze or label permanently. The Zen self isn't something you can isolate and study like a bug under a microscope. It's slipperier, more dynamic.
More like a process than a thing.
Precisely. More like a process.
Yeah.
And that really pulls the rug out from under our usual understanding of me, suggesting that maybe our gut feeling about who we are is, well, maybe a bit flawed.
Okay, my mind is already spinning a bit. So if it's not fixed, not an object, what are we talking about then?
Well, to give you a starting point, Zen talks about the self as a dynamic process or a flow or maybe a set of constantly shifting conditions.
Like water. You can't really hold on to it in one shape.
That's a good way to think about it. It's real, it's there, but it's not fixed. It flows, adapts, changes. And this idea really sets us up for some of the analogies Zen uses, which help make this less abstract, more felt.
Right, because just saying dynamic process can feel a bit intellectual.
It can.
This actually reminds me so much of that dialogue in our sources between Kenzo and Yuno. Kenzo was rereading Descartes, I think, therefore I am, and finding it solid, satisfying.
Intellectually.
But then he starts to doubt. He asks, but what if the thinking part is just noise? What if I'm not the thinker at all?
That's a huge leap, isn't it? From certainty to radical doubt.
It really is. And Yuno's response is just perfect. Cuts right through. Now you're speaking Zen.
Yes. It perfectly captures that shift we're talking about, moving away from identifying with a fixed thinker.
Okay, so let's dive into that. How does Zen describe this non-fixed, process-like self? Those analogies sound helpful.
Yeah, the analogies are key, because we need to move beyond just, definitions. We need to feel it. And Yuno, in the sources, gives this brilliant illustration comparing a song versus statue.
Okay, song versus statue. How does that work?
Well, think about a statue. It's solid, right? Fixed, unchanging in its form. You can walk around it, touch it, describe its features. It's stable over time. It has clear boundaries. You point and say, that's the statue.
Right. Definitely an object.
But a song is completely different. It's fundamentally a process. It exists only as it unfolds through time, note by note.
You can't grab a song.
Exactly. You can experience it, listen to it, be moved by it, but it has no fixed physical substance you can isolate. It's always becoming, moment by moment. It's unfolding.
Ah, I see. So the self is like the song, not the statue.
Precisely. When Kenzo makes that connection, just says exactly. It nails the Zen view. The self isn't a static noun, like a statue. It's an active verb, like the singing of the song. It is its own dynamic movement.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. It's a helpful image.
And there's another one Yuno uses just as powerful, the flame.
Okay, a flame, how does that work?
Imagine a candle flame.
Yeah.
It obviously exists. You see its light, feel its heat. It does things it illuminates.
Sure.
But try to grab it. Try to hold on to the flame itself.
It's gone. You can't.
Right? It disappears. It has no solid, fixed substance, no unchanging core. A flame is a continuous process of combustion. It's constantly consuming fuel, constantly changing, emitting light and heat.
It's never the same flame from one second to the next, really.
Exactly. New molecules burning, light radiating out, yet it's undeniably real and present in each moment. It perfectly illustrates that ephemeral, ungraspable nature of the Zen self. It's real, it's experienced, it has effects, but there's no fixed core you can label the self. It's just flowing, renewing itself constantly.
Wow. Song, flame. These are very different from the solid entity idea.
Completely different. And they help us understand that the self in Zen isn't some unchanging core like a soul or a permanent personality. It's more like this collection of experiences, perceptions, thoughts, feelings, interactions, all constantly in flux, interplaying with everything around it.
So my identity isn't a fixed thing I have.
It's more like something fluid, adaptive, responding to whatever's happening inside and out. It's not something you are in a static way. It's something you're constantly doing or experiencing.
Like the weather. Always changing, but still recognizable as weather.
That's another great analogy, actually.
Yeah.
Unique each moment, constantly shifting patterns, but we still call it weather.
Okay, so what does this do to our idea of identity then? If the self is a process, a song, a flame, does the idea of single separate me just dissolve?
It really starts to. That whole Western quest for the answer to who am I, an answer that assumes there's a fixed thing to find, begins to look a bit, well, maybe misguided from this perspective.
It's like asking, what's the fixed shape of a river?
Exactly. Or a wave. What's the fixed nature of a wave? A wave is movement. It's a process of the ocean. You can't separate the wave from the water. To understand the wave, you need to see the ocean it's part of.
That wave analogy, that really hits home. It makes the constant motion so clear. But, okay, if it's all constant motion, this flow, how do we account for a sense of continuity? You know, feeling like the same person waking up each day, if there isn't a fixed me directing things.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads us directly into perhaps the most challenging but also potentially liberating concept from Zen that our sources explore.
Which is?
The illusion of the thinker.
Okay, the illusion of the thinker. Yeah, this is one of those ideas that can really make your head spin, like you said, but maybe in a good way.
Potentially, yes. Very liberating, potentially. The core illusion from the Zen viewpoint is this deep assumption we all seem to have that there's a separate me inside, an agent who is actively producing our thought.
Like a little CEO in the head directing mental traffic?
Kind of, yeah. We instinctively feel, I am thinking these thoughts. I am worrying. I am planning. I am judging. We feel like the author, the generator. But Zen asks us to look really, really closely at that assumption.
And Kenzo, in the dialogue, he has this moment during meditation, right? Can you remind us what happened?
Yes, it's a pivotal moment for him. He describes realizing that thoughts were happening, but there wasn't really a me producing them. They were just arising.
Just arising, not being made by him.
Exactly. It wasn't that the thinking stopped. The thoughts were still there. But his perception of the source fundamentally shifted. He couldn't find a distinct generator that he could label me. The thoughts just appeared, spontaneously, unbidden.
Like clouds drifting across the sky, maybe?
That's a classic analogy used in meditation, yes.
Yeah.
And he notes how profound this was. And that changes everything because it just pulls apart that idea of a central command center running the show.
Wow. Okay. So thoughts happen, but there's no thinker.
That's the core insight. It flies in the face of our habits, our language, I think our basic intuitions. But Zen suggests, yes, there is thinking. Thoughts are clearly happening. You're experiencing them right now listening to this.
Right.
But there isn't necessarily a separate thinker doing the thinking. Thoughts are just phenomena that occur, like sounds being heard or sights being seen. They're part of the flow of experience.
Not actively generated by this fixed internal me.
Correct. And Yuno gives that brilliant analogy to make it more intuitive. Just like there's raining, but no rainer.
I remember that. Explain that again.
Well, when it rains, is there someone up in the sky deciding, okay, time to rain now?
No, of course not.
No. Rain is a meteorological phenomenon, a complex process. There's the activity of raining, but no separate agent, no rainer doing it.
Okay, I get it.
In the same way, Zen suggests there's the activity of thinking, but not necessarily a separate thinker producing the thoughts. They just arise, like rain falls, or like your heart beats. It just does. You don't consciously command every beat.
That actually makes a surprisingly abstract idea feel quite relatable. You just observe your mind without automatically saying, I did that.
Exactly. It invites that shift in observation. And this obviously challenges our sense of control over our thoughts, doesn't it?
Hugely. If thoughts are just arising, then the idea that I am consciously generating and controlling all of them, that starts to look shaky.
Right. It doesn't deny thought itself. Thought is real. It shapes our experience.
Yeah.
But it questions the source, the agent we usually assume is behind it. Our relationship to thoughts changes from being the assumed author
to being more like an observer?
a witness.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
A witness to the arising thoughts. And again, this doesn't mean we're not responsible for actions that might follow thoughts, but it reframes that whole internal dynamic.
And the impact on self-perception, as Kenzo said, changes everything. If I'm not the one producing all this mental chatter, then that whole Western self, built on the thinking, choosing, reflecting agent, it starts to seem less solid.
It really does. It kind of crumbles. And that can be scary, maybe. But it also opens up space for a different way of being, a self that isn't constantly burdened with performing its existence through thinking.
Less pressure to create and maintain that identity through constant mental effort, more allowing, observing, just being whatever arises.
That's the direction it points towards,
Okay.
a fundamental shift in our internal landscape. Okay, let me pause here and ask you, the listener, what stands out here? Have you ever had that feeling? Maybe just zoning out or trying to sleep and thoughts just pop up. Random stuff. Did you decide to think that specific thought right then, or did it just arrive? Kenzo's experience is powerful because it challenges that gut feeling of being the conductor. How does that shift feel? It could be incredibly freeing, couldn't it? Taking off the pressure of constantly defining yourself through your thoughts, like a weight lifted. Maybe freedom isn't about controlling thoughts, but understanding where they come from. Or maybe where they don't come
Understanding their nature, yeah.
Okay, so this huge shift, understanding the thinker, might be an illusion. Seeing the self as a process brings us right back around. Back to that fundamental question, who am I?
The big one.
And in the West, like we discussed, the impulse is nearly always answer it. Find the definition. Find the label. Settle on an identity. Get that solid ground.
Pin it down.
Yeah. But Zen, having taken us down this very different path, seems to invite a completely different response, doesn't it? It's not about finding the answer anymore.
No, it really isn't. Kenzo's journey, guided by Yuno, leads to this quite radical conclusion about the question itself. Maybe that question doesn't need an answer in the way we think. Maybe it needs listening.
Listening. What does that mean here? Not listening for a voice telling you the answer.
No, not intellectually listening for a definition.
Yeah.
It's more about being present, being open, allowing what is to be there without immediately trying to grasp it, define it, categorize it.
So shifting from trying to know who you are.
Simply being. And observing what unfolds in that being. Dropping the mental effort of constructing an answer and instead opening up to direct, unfiltered experience.
And this connects to silence, right? Kenzo picked up on that. He asked, so silence isn't the absence of identity, it's the space in which something deeper can be heard.
And Yuno's response was just,
yes.
Simple, direct, affirming. Because in that silence, Yuno explains, the performer self rests.
The performer self. Can you say more about that? What is that?
It's that part of us, maybe driven by ego or social conditioning, that feels it constantly needs to do something to be valid. Define itself, achieve things, get validation through actions, thoughts, opinions, roles.
The part that needs that ready answer to, who am I, to prove itself.
Exactly. It's often running on this low-level anxiety of not being enough or not knowing enough. It's that internal monologue constantly constructing and defending a particular identity.
Okay. So when that performer rests in silence, what happens?
Something profound, according to Yuno. Something more fluid, more alive starts to emerge.
Fluid and alive, like the song, the flame.
Precisely. And crucially, this emerging self is experienced as not separate from the world. It connects back to that dynamic process, that flow. It's a self that feels interconnected, part of the whole unfolding reality, not some isolated entity locked inside.
Kenzo tries to grasp this, asking, like a self that doesn't need a name.
And Yuno clarifies, like a self that's not separate from the world. It's about dissolving those artificial boundaries we draw between me and not me. Our true nature isn't confined. It's part of this vast, interconnected flow.
Wow. Okay.
So ultimately, what Zen seems to encourage is letting that question, who am I, actually open you up rather than close you down.
Open versus close. How?
Well, trying to force a fixed answer, a definition, that's closing off. You put yourself in a conceptual box.
Yeah.
You limit your experience to fit the label.
Right. You define yourself as something and maybe miss everything else.
Exactly. But opening up means embracing the fluidity, staying curious, allowing yourself to just be present with the vastness of experience before you slap a label on it. It's about dropping the need for that final static answer.
And instead, maybe asking a different question.
Yes. Asking, as Yuno suggests, what's here when I stop asking, who am I?
Right.
What remains when the questioning mind, the performer self, gets quiet?
What's here when I stop asking? That feels radically different. It takes all the pressure off finding the answer. It shifts the whole game from an intellectual puzzle to just being aware, experiencing.
It really does.
And Kenzo's final thought in that dialogue really lands, doesn't it? Maybe we've been answering the wrong question all along. Not who am I, but what's here when I stop asking? It feels like permission to just stop chasing.
Stop chasing the definition. Allow some space.
And his very last line, I think I'll stop chasing the answer for a bit. It sounds like such a relief, like dropping a heavy bag.
It does. And Yuno's response is perfect. That's already a beginning. It's not about finding a new fixed answer called nothing or flow. It's about embracing a whole new relationship with the question. A way of being.
Rooted in presence, not concepts. Simply being. Hashtag tag shag outro. So what a journey. We've gone from that familiar Western idea of a self, solid, separate, defined by thinking and choosing, all the way to the Zen perspective. The self is fluid, dynamic, a process, not an object, like a song or a flame.
Yeah, quite a contrast.
And we dug into that really mind-bending idea, the illusion of the thinker, the possibility that thoughts just arise without a fixed me generating them.
Like raining without a rainer.
Exactly. And seeing how all of this completely changes how we might approach that fundamental question, who am I? Shifting from desperately trying to answer it
to maybe just listening. Listening to the silence when the performer self rests. Moving from closing ourselves off with definitions.
You opening up to what's actually here right now when we stop asking.
And this really leaves us with something important for you, the listener, to maybe mull over after this deep dive.
Yeah, what's that?
Well, if you find yourself tired of that constant effort, trying to define who you are, wrestling with labels, feeling that pressure, what if being is actually more fundamental, more important than knowing?
Being versus knowing.
Yeah. What if just existing, experiencing life moment by moment is deeper than having some neat cognitive definition of yourself?
That's a powerful distinction to consider.
Think about it. How might embracing this idea of a dynamic, flowing, ungraspable self actually change things day to day? Your interactions, your anxieties about identity, that constant striving for purpose or validation.
Could it be freeing?
Maybe. It's not about giving up on yourself, but perhaps connecting with a reality of your existence that's deeper than concepts. So we'd invite you to maybe just sit with that question sometimes, in a quiet moment. What's here when I stop asking?
Just notice, without needing an immediate answer, see what emerges when you just allow yourself to be present.
That's the invitation.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the very elusive nature of the self.
It's fascinating.
We really hope this exploration offered not just, interesting ideas, but maybe a fresh way to look at your own experience of being. Take these thoughts with you. Explore them. Maybe in silence, maybe just by noticing your thoughts without judgment.
See where it leads.
Until next time, keep diving deep.